everyone, Heidi here from The Nest. So today we're going to talk about seizures, mostly because I spent last night in emergency with my own son, who is 3 3/4, and he had a rather large seizure at 6 p.m. last night with my husband. I wasn't actually here, I was in another town somewhere. So, and unfortunately, the last time this happened to our older son, I wasn't there either. So very ironic considering what I do for a living. But yeah, maybe I'm just not supposed to be there. I don't know. Maybe I wouldn't cope very well in an emergency with my own children. So we're going to talk about seizures and the different types of seizures and what you should do and how they can look after a seizure as well. So that also is, if you're looking at this on a video, I maybe don't look very fresh because I've spent my first night ever as an inpatient in hospital. I've never had a night in hospital, not for me or any of my children, before last night. So very, very strange. And yeah, I don't look very fresh for it. So I'd listen to this on a podcast if I were you. So let's talk about seizures. There's lots of different types of seizures. I know we've covered febrile convulsions before, and that's what we cover in our first aid classes that we do for parents. But there's lots of different types of seizures, but they can all look the same. So it can be quite confusing. So seizures are, they can be absent seizures, or they can be the tonic-clonic seizures, which are like convulsions where arms and legs are moving like in a rhythmic motion. The person is unconscious. That's what we would call like what most seizures are. So most seizures would be described as convulsions or fits or tonic-clonic seizures, and that's when the arms and legs are moving as well. And normally in a tonic-clonic seizure or a convulsion, the person is unresponsive. And usually they're breathing, but probably not breathing properly. So they may change colour. Sometimes they are incontinent, which is what happened to my son last night, and he never wets himself. And he was actually incontinent before my husband realised there was anything wrong. So because he was just sitting on the sofa and he wasn't doing anything or saying anything. But he, as we know now, that actually sat there and wet himself, and that is he's never done that. So it's obviously starting before he actually started shaking and doing those kind of convulsion type movements. So another type of seizure would be called like an absent seizure or a local seizure. And that's where the person just starts to act differently. Maybe they're confused, unusual behavior. And that can be what we call a local seizure. So it might not look to the eye what you would think a seizure would look like. There are other types of seizures where people or children will just almost check out and go vacant, and they won't move and convulse, but they just go completely vacant. Or they might just have a little tick, like on the side of the mouth or the hands. They might even just be doing this. So seizures can look very different. Children who have epilepsy or adults that have epilepsy, they might have a type of seizure that they have where it looks very similar each time. Or the parent will know that this is definitely a seizure. So yeah, they can look very different. The difference with what my son had yesterday, that was a febrile convulsion. And that means that he had a convulsion because his body temperature went up very quickly, and it caused the body to have a fit. So as soon as I got the phone call, I actually knew that he already had a fever just half an hour before I'd learned that he had a fever. So although I was obviously really worried, I immediately wasn't in panic mode because I knew that it was very likely to be a febrile convulsion, which is, to be honest, with seizures, best case scenario, because we know that they don't come to any harm with febrile convulsions. So yeah, it was actually a good thing. So with once someone has a seizure, they do what we call afterwards. They have what we call like a postictal period, and postictal is post seizure. It's when someone is just not quite there. They're not quite back in the room yet. They're very a bit sort of absent, a bit confused. Sometimes they're nauseous, sometimes they'll vomit, which is what happened with my son. He was actually confused and not quite with it for about an hour and a half. When the nurse asked him who I was, he said, my name's Thomas, which is his best friend at daycare, and was just looking at me through very glassy eyes. It was also bedtime. It was an hour after bedtime actually by this point. So with those two things combined, it was a really bad situation to, you could see that he was just not with it at all. And that is what we call post-ictal, and that is the post-seizure type behavior. So they come out of the seizure, but they're still not quite right. So if a child has a seizure in a wheelchair or a stroller or a car seat, what we should be doing is just supporting their head, making sure that they've got good head support, keeping them where they are while they're actually having the seizure. Then when they're finished, we'll get them out and we'll lay them down on their left-hand side. So with a seizure, it's all about not trying to interfere too much with the person while they're actually having the seizure. So when you come across someone, child, adult, anyone that's having a seizure, what we need to do is just support them in making sure they're in a safe place while they're actually having the seizure. We shouldn't move them around too much or pick them up or walk around with them because they're moving. They might be doing this and you're carrying them and you're going to be worried, and they're very stiff and we might drop them or we might hurt them anymore. So the best thing to do is just to get some items to get put under their head, keep them comfortable, whether that be sofa cushions, doonas, anything. Keep that person comfortable. If they're on a really hard floor, just grab something to pop underneath them. You can shimmy them onto it, but don't move them. Once they're actually finished having the convulsion or seizure or fit, whatever we want to call it, then we roll them onto their side, okay? Preferably the left side, but any side will do. And this is because we want to keep their airway clear. Often people, especially children, will vomit after a seizure, and we want to make sure their airway is clear. So by rolling them on their side, we can, they're not on their back, so they're not going to choke on their vomit. So if they vomit, it's going to come out and it's going to keep the airway clear. We can support the head just up slightly as well, just to keep that airway open. If the airway is blocked, we'll have to start with that ABC, go into the actual first aid for airway blockage and breathing and circulation, but that's not for today's talk. But the point of it is to keep them supported. Now, if it's your child's first seizure, you don't know what it's about, you don't know why it's there, so we call an ambulance. If it's a subsequent fever and they've had more than one and you've spoken to your healthcare professional about it, whether it's a febrile convulsion or if the child has epilepsy, then you will have a plan. You would have been told. Usually if a child has epilepsy, the parents are quite well versed in what to do and what criteria to call an ambulance. Normally it's when it lasts more than 5 minutes or the rescue medication doesn't work. There'll be like an actual action plan for that child with their specific seizures. With a febrile convulsion, the first time a child has a febrile convulsion, if they're very hot, we should call the ambulance first time, every time. Once you get to the hospital, you will get a lot of education about febrile convulsion, and they may say that next time this happens, if you're confident that it's with a temperature, you may not need to bring them back in, but that's kind of up to you and how you feel about that. There's nothing you can do to stop a seizure unless you have a child with epilepsy and you have rescue medication. That helps to stop a seizure after a certain period of time sometimes, but there's nothing else you can do to stop a seizure. With a febrile convulsion, just know that there's nothing you can do to prevent it. Even giving Panadol and ibuprofen won't necessarily help to prevent a febrile convulsion. The temperature shoots up so quickly that we don't really have a chance to be able to stop it. So there's nothing you can do. All we do is support them in that seizure, call an ambulance, call for help. And we were very lucky last night that our neighbours we've got a really good neighbourhood here, and one of our neighbours came and helped my husband and popped my son into the recovery position once he'd stopped having his seizure, and kept him safe while the ambulance arrived. So, because that was my youngest son's first convulsion, so that was the right thing to do. He was post-ictal at the hospital for about an hour and a half. It was a bit long for my liking. And it was also, he was very tired because it was bedtime. So we decided, along with the doctor who was on, to stay in overnight and be monitored overnight. And this morning he's bouncing off the walls. There's nothing wrong with him. He's fine. So obviously there was a fever there, but other than that, there's no harm done, which is classic for febrile convulsions. Okay, so what you need to remember with seizures is make sure that the child is in a safe position when they're having a seizure. If they have a seizure in a stroller or a chair, make sure we just keep their heads safe, and then when they've finished, we pop them on the side. Every child, once they finish their convulsion, should be popped onto their side, and then we'll call an ambulance unless we know otherwise, if we have an action plan or anything like that. So I hope this is helpful. This is the sort of thing that we would do in our first aid classes. Hopefully you won't have to go through what we went through yesterday. However, it is relatively common. A febrile convulsion is 1 in 30 children will have one, so it's relatively common. But unfortunately it's very scary, but there's nothing we can do about it. But we do know that they're quite harmless in the long run. So I hope this is helpful. Please drop your comments below. Has your child ever had a febrile convulsion? Or do you know anyone that's had one? We do have our free virtual first aid kit, which is at the bottom of every page on our website, and it will be underneath this audio and video as well. So in the meantime, it's been great to have you. Take care. Bye bye.